Welcome to my review for the Quatermass Experiment. You'll find all my other Hammer reviews in my Hammer playlist. So this film came out in 1955, which officially then makes it the oldest horror film I have ever seen, beating the previous record holder, 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. I don't want to say that the Quatermass Experiment is the oldest film I've ever seen, period, because I'm pretty sure when I was a kid I would have seen loads of those really old Disney films from the 1930s. As to why I came to this film this week, well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I was looking through Hammer's filmography and I noticed that there were 3 of these Quatermass films, and they made the third one quite some distance after the second one. So clearly this was something that they really liked, that they'd done and wanted to keep coming back to. And also, this is very much a sci-fi horror. I love it when those two genres are mixed together, and Hammer didn't really go on to do an awful lot in the way of sci-fi. So all in all, this promised to be a really fascinating little side adventure for me in my continuing quest through the Hammer universe. It was directed by Val Guest, who went on to do The Abominable Snowman, plus a couple of thrillers for Hammer, Hell is a City and Paranoiac. He also went on to do the only James Bond film I've never seen, which is 1967's Casino Royale. In terms of actors, there's nobody in this one that I'm that familiar with, although one of the smaller roles is played by Thora Hird, who was quite a famous person in the town where I grew up, although I've never seen her in a film before. I think her daughter went on to be in one of Hammer's other films from the 1960s, but I forget which one it is off the top of my head. So what actually is the Quatermass Experiment, if you've never seen it before? Well, let me start by saying that Quatermass is not a code word for an experiment. Quatermass is actually the name of the main character in this. And before the story begins, he sends 3 astronauts in a rocket ship to explore the deepest, darkest bowels of space. They're not intended to go to any particular planet or anything. They're just sort of sent out to explore, see what they can find and come back. And what you've got to remember is this was before the 1969 moon landings. In fact, I'm not even sure if there would have been any actual space travel by 1955. So when the film begins, that's just when this ship is returning. It crash lands in a field, but when the doors open, quite bizarrely, 2 of the 3 astronauts are completely missing. What happened to them? God only knows. The one guy who has come back has turned mute, which isn't very helpful because nobody can therefore ask him what happened to the other 2. He's quickly carted off to hospital because he's really shaky and he's not acting right, but we, the viewer, know that clearly something extraterrestrial has happened to this guy and he's very soon going to become a threat to anybody he comes across. The whole setup of the film, with its intriguing mystery of the missing astronauts, it feels a little bit like an episode of The X-Files. And funnily enough, the title of this film has the E missing off the word experiment, so it reads Xperiment, X-Files. And also the Quatermass character is only called by his second name, a bit like Mulder in the X-Files. So I kind of wondered whether the X-Files creator Chris Carter might have been a fan of this film. Who knows? So eventually this hospitalized astronaut character starts to turn into a horrible alien, but it's a really slow process to the point where he's still mostly human throughout the majority of the movie, albeit the alien has a huge degree of control over him. I'd say it's sort of 75% in the alien's control and maybe 25% in the astronaut's control. There is one scene where he passes up the chance to kill a kid because it's like the human part of him wills it not to happen, wills the body to walk away, but it's just too much effort to do all the time. So for the most part, what the alien wants, the alien gets, and he does do quite a bit of killing in this film. Not all the time. He doesn't kill on sight like, say, a Michael Myers or a Jason Voorhees. Sometimes he's in the presence of other people for quite a few minutes before he finally kills them, but this adds a big layer of tension to the whole thing. But where the film really comes into its own is when this creature finally becomes fully alien and it's really all blobby and disgusting and he no longer has any human characteristics. we get two versions of the alien towards the end. One is a really small version, which we briefly see in a science lab. And then we get this much larger, fully sized one, which I'll come to in a little while. But this smaller version in the science lab freaked me out a little bit because it's like a little starfishy type thing, which is all grimy. And it reminded me of the creature from this quite recent horror sci-fi film called Life, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Rebecca Ferguson. The creature in that film was absolutely horrible, and it was so brutal. So when the character came in the lab who discovers this thing on the floor, my first reaction was, "Don't touch that thing! I've seen that thing before." And then the better part of my brain kicked into gear, and I realised, no, that's a completely different horror universe. Plus, this thing in the Quatermass Experiment is dead. But the larger version that we see later on is very much alive. It sort of takes up residence in the rafters of Westminster Abbey. I'm quite certain that that can't have been the real Westminster Abbey where they were filming. You'd have to let me know, but it's really creepy how this creature just gets up into the rafters and sits there. Now, cynically, I guess you could say, well, they didn't want to have the thing walking around because it just wouldn't look very good. The effects that they've done for this creature, just keeping it still, are absolutely amazing for 1955. And actually, it's not completely unrealistic that it would just sit up there for the longest time. I have two pets, a cat and a dog. Believe me, they sit still for hours on end at times. And the way that the creature in this behaves, it sort of reminds me of the end of Alien, when the xenomorph just sits in the corner really nonchalantly, even though Sigourney Weaver, or Ripley I should say, is moving around nearby. I guess the alien doesn't consider Ripley to be a threat at that point. It doesn't know that she's setting a trap for it. And I kind of feel that that's what the alien's thinking at the end of this film, because there are characters moving around underneath it, trying to set up this electricity trap for it, and it doesn't move, but it doesn't feel silly that it's not moving, so the film can get away with that. And the moment where it does get electrocuted, it looks really good. It's pretty decent special effects they've come up with. And there are lots of big high tension moments just before then when the characters are almost underneath it. And I was convinced that a tentacle was going to come down and get somebody at some point, and it didn't bother me that it didn't happen. Just the threat that it might made for some really good horror. Away from the Abbey, there's some good use of a zoo with actual live animals, which are part of the story. And I like the choice of field they've gone for in the opening scene of the movie. This story really sets its stall out very early on with some high quality stuff right from the get-go. So the first thing we see is this young couple necking in some hay. And then we hear what, to my ear, sounds like helicopter rotors, but it turns out to be a rocket ship, go figure. But then all these emergency services turn up, ambulances and fire engines. And when the characters start talking outside the rocket ship about what they're going to do, there's some good depth in the background. There's lots and lots of extras. It feels like a lot of money's been put into these early scenes. And the story makes an attempt to be serious with the science, if not necessarily realistic, because there's this whole thing about how nobody can go in the rocket ship until it's cooled down a little bit. I think a lot of films wouldn't bother with that. They just have people immediately running up to it and ripping the door off without getting their hands burned. Inside the rocket ship, it looks very minimalist. I guess even today, I couldn't tell you what the inside of such a thing should look like. One of the best scenes in the film actually takes place inside this thing, sort of. So about halfway through the story, they finally figure out how to look at the black box to find out what happened to the astronauts. And it's a very creepy scene because it's played almost entirely without audio. And even after watching it, I'm still not entirely sure what happened to these guys. There's a few flashes of light. These astronauts sort of look around and look really confused as to what's happening to them. Quatermass takes all this on board and investigates the whole thing really seriously. This is a serious movie. There's only really one funny bit that I can remember. So there's this police inspector character who is helping Quatermass a lot of the time, and there comes a moment where he's got to leave his wife to go off to some emergency that's happened, and his wife sort of says, well, what about dinner? And he replies, cook it and keep your fingers crossed. I love that line. Going back to Quatermass, I'd say the only negative I have about this movie is some of his character decisions. He's mostly a serious character, but we find out near the beginning of the movie that He sent these astronauts into space without even getting the proper clearance to do so. That's really irresponsible. He could surely get arrested for that, but the general attitude, I think, is just, well, that was really bad, Quatermass, don't do it again. But he's not learned anything by the end of the movie. This alien threat has only just been contained, and then we get this final bit where seemingly he's just going to send another rocket ship into space and keep on exploring without any new safeguards being put in place. Now, I know nothing about Quatermass 2. I've not seen a plot synopsis. I know nothing about it, but surely that film is not just going to be the new spaceship coming back with another alien and oops, I did it again. Surely not. I don't really have any more negatives to talk about. For the most part, this is an excellent film, and it's only further encouraged me to explore other horror films of the era. But before I get on and show you what score I'm going to give for this, I'll quickly hold up the version of the film I have. I've got it on DVD. There is a Blu-ray in existence, I believe, but it's not available in my region. But this version's fine, in all honesty. The picture is crystal clear, audio very, very good. There's not much on it in the way of features. I think there's a couple of very short mini docs and a trailer. The creature looks like he's turning into the Incredible Hulk in that artwork. You'll notice as well there's an alternative title, The Creeping Unknown, but I think I prefer the title The Quatermass Experiment. The creature in this doesn't really creep. I mean, when he's in human form, he's walking quite briskly, and when he's in alien form, he's deadly still. So the word creeping doesn't really work for me. Quatermass Experiment is better, although I would have called it the Quatermass Expedition. In my brain, experiments take place in science labs. What the astronauts do before this movie starts is more of a journey, an expedition. But I'm thinking about this way too much, aren't I? Right, let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this movie. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bloody axes out of 5. My initial reaction after the movie was over was that this was going to be 3.5, but it was a few days ago that I watched the film now, and it's really stuck in my mind. I've been thinking about it a lot. It's settled really well on me, this film. And in fact, last night I almost watched it again. I was of a mind to. I didn't in the end, but I could still see myself doing it in the next few days before I finally slap it on the shelf and forget about it for a while. But I'm definitely going to watch 2 and 3, and in the case of 2, I'm going to be really strict on myself and not look up the plot for it until I actually get the DVD or the Blu-ray in my hand and put it on. Right, I'll be back with another Hammer review very, very soon. Until next time, cheerio.